December 19th, 2025 was supposed to be quiet. No breaking alerts, no emergency hearings, no reason for the industry to stop and look in the mirror. But instead, it became the day everything people had whispered about for years stopped being deniable. Because what surfaced wasn't new behavior, it was confirmation. For a long time, the story around power in music followed a familiar script. If you were successful, protected, and surrounded by the right names, you were untouchable. Questions were brushed aside as jealousy. Discomfort was reframed as misunderstanding. And anyone who spoke too loudly was labeled bitter, unstable, or looking for attention. That system worked because disbelief was easier than reckoning. Until it wasn't. What makes this moment different isn't one accusation or one headline. It's the pattern finally being visible all at once. The same warnings repeated by different people across different years. The same unease described in different words. The same environments, the same pressure, the same silence afterward. When viewed separately, it was easy to dismiss. Viewed together, it becomes impossible to ignore. This is where the story truly begins. Not with scandal, but with the realization that certain figures didn't rise by accident, and they didn't maintain power by chance. Influence was built through proximity, control, and the unspoken understanding that some doors only open if you don't ask what's happening behind them. For years, those doors stayed shut to the public. But once a few cracked open, everything inside started to spill out. Before going further, understand this clearly. This isn't about shock for shock's sake. It's about how long an industry can protect itself before the truth forces its way through. And if you're still here watching, you already know this story goes deeper than one person. If you want to understand how these systems actually work when the cameras are off, make sure you're subscribed. Stories like this don't end when the headlines fade. They evolve quietly, and most people miss what happens next. What the documentary reveals early on is something uncomfortable but crucial. The warnings were never subtle. They were ignored because acknowledging them would have meant admitting how much power had been misplaced. People didn't stay silent because they didn't know. They stayed silent because knowing came with consequences. Careers were built in those rooms. Careers were also broken there. Artists describe being pulled into spaces that felt exclusive at first, even flattering. You're told this is how the game works, how relationships are built, how trust is earned. And once you're inside, the rules shift. What was framed as opportunity begins to feel conditional. What was sold as freedom starts to feel controlled, and leaving doesn't feel as simple as walking out the door. That's the part the public rarely sees, because from the outside, everything looks successful. Awards, partnerships, public praise, legacy, but behind the image, there's tension, quiet resistance, people pulling back without explanation. Projects that suddenly fall apart, deals that never quite materialize, and through it all, a sense that speaking openly would cost more than staying quiet. This isn't unique to one artist or one era. It's a cycle the industry has repeated for decades. What changes now is that people are no longer isolated in their experiences. They're being connected. December 19th, 2025 matters because it represents a shift from disbelief to recognition. When enough stories align, they stop being rumors. They become evidence of a system that relied on people looking the other way. And once that recognition sets in, the power dynamic changes. Because the most dangerous thing for any protected system isn't exposure, it's understanding. When audiences start seeing patterns instead of personalities, the illusion breaks. Loyalty weakens. Silence becomes riskier than truth. This moment isn't loud yet. It doesn't need to be. The real impact is happening in boardrooms, legal offices, and private conversations where people are reassessing who they stand next to and why. And that's why this story doesn't start with an ending. It starts with the realization that the version of events people were sold for years was incomplete, and that what's coming next won't be controlled by the same voices anymore. What becomes clear as the story moves forward is that this wasn't chaos, it was structure. Power didn't just exist in these spaces, it was managed, protected, and enforced through silence. The documentary doesn't rely on shock value, it relies on consistency. Different voices, different timelines, same underlying message. Once you enter certain circles, autonomy starts to shrink. This is where Burna Boy's name changes the temperature of the conversation. Because Burna didn't arrive hungry or dependent. He arrived already global, Grammy in hand, stadiums sold out, cultural influence secured without permission from the American industry machine. That's what makes his experience so important. When someone who doesn't need saving starts signaling discomfort, people pay attention. What's outlined isn't a dramatic fallout, but something quieter and more unsettling. Subtle pressure, creative friction that doesn't feel collaborative, deals that look powerful on paper but come with invisible strings attached. The kind of arrangements where success is no longer yours alone. It's monitored, shaped, and negotiated behind closed doors. And here's the key detail most people miss. Control doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like guidance, mentorship. Let me help you move differently. But help becomes leverage when one side holds access to platforms, distribution, and legacy influence. The documentary places heavy emphasis on this shift, the moment when partnership starts to feel like ownership. Burna's public statements never explode. They don't accuse. They pull back. They sound measured, careful, almost restrained. And that restraint speaks volumes. Artists who feel safe don't talk like that. Artists who feel cornered do. Meanwhile, the industry reaction follows a familiar script. Silence from the powerful, vague statements from insiders, media narratives that try to flatten complexity into gossip. But what they can't erase is the pattern forming in plain sight. Because Burna isn't alone. Other artists have quietly exited similar situations over the years. Some disappeared, some pivoted genres, some took breaks that were never fully explained. When you line those stories up next to each other, the similarities become uncomfortable. The documentary doesn't accuse the audience of missing it. It shows how the system trained everyone to miss it. If you question too much, you're difficult. If you leave, you're ungrateful. If you speak, you're unstable. That's how power protects itself without ever raising its voice. What makes this moment different is timing. The culture has shifted. Audiences are no longer satisfied with surface-level success stories. They want context. They want accountability. And they're noticing when artists reclaim independence after stepping away from certain alliances. Burna's recalibration didn't come with press conferences or public feuds. It came with distance, with control over his sound returning, with interviews that felt less constrained, with the subtle but unmistakable energy of someone reclaiming their footing. That's not coincidence. And this is where the documentary becomes less about individuals and more about warning signs. Because the question isn't whether one collaboration went wrong. The question is how many people felt the same pressure but didn't have Burna's leverage to walk away. Power looks different depending on who holds it. For decades, the industry rewarded proximity to gatekeepers. Now it's watching what happens when artists don't need those gates anymore. When global reach bypasses old systems, when influence no longer flows in one direction. That shift creates friction, and friction exposes truths. By the end of this section, the audience isn't being told what to think. They're being shown how to recognize imbalance when they see it. The signs were always there. They were just scattered. Now they're aligned. And once alignment happens, the narrative changes. Because this isn't about canceling legends or rewriting history. It's about understanding how history was shaped and who paid the cost for that version to exist. As the documentary moves deeper, the tone shifts from observation to exposure, not in the tabloid sense, but structural exposure, how influence actually operates when cameras are off and contracts are signed in quiet rooms. This is where the story stops being about individual behavior and starts being about systems. Because power, real power, doesn't rely on scandal. It relies on leverage. What's laid out is a recurring mechanism. Access is currency. Who gets invited? Who gets promoted? Who gets protected? And more importantly, who doesn't? The documentary shows how proximity to influence can feel like elevation at first, until you realize the cost isn't written anywhere. It's implied. Artists are encouraged to believe they're being chosen, but selection often comes with expectations that aren't spelled out, only enforced later. When those expectations aren't met, the response isn't always confrontation, it's withdrawal. Opportunities quietly disappear. Calls stop getting returned. Support becomes conditional. That's the environment Burna Boy stepped into and quickly recognized. What's unsettling is how familiar this pattern sounds when compared to past industry stories. Different genres, different eras, same mechanics.
Artists praised publicly, constrained privately. Independence celebrated until it threatens control. Collaboration framed as family until family starts keeping score. The documentary doesn't accuse anyone of orchestrating chaos. It shows how chaos isn't necessary when systems are already built to self-correct, when silence, reputation, and fear do most of the work. And then there's the role of documentation. Footage, recordings, contracts, NDAs, metadata. These aren't just legal tools, they're power instruments. The documentary suggests that information has long been used as insurance, not always to destroy, but to remind. A reminder that someone else holds part of your narrative. That's why so many people stay quiet. That's why when someone speaks, they rarely speak fully. What makes Burna's case significant is that he didn't explode. He repositioned. He removed himself from environments that felt restrictive. And in doing so, he demonstrated something dangerous.